Welcome to the Science of Philanthropy seminar series. We are convening these seminars in lieu of the annual conference this year, but we will be back together in Indianapolis next September, so I hope you will join us. We have a terrific lineup once a month, all the way through May of 2022. So if you've joined us today, you'll receive notifications for all the seminars to come. Each one is hosted by one of the organizers of what we call SPI, the Science of Philanthropy Initiative. So I hope you'll make this a monthly habit. We are all trying to use the pandemic in ways to advance dialogues and conversations in new ways. So thank you for being with us. Today, we have a special session. We have three researchers who have spearheaded a major new study of American nonprofits, titled A New Panel Study of US Nonprofits and Their Donations. I will give brief introductions just so that you know who is who, but I would encourage you to look at their bios because they have distinguished careers and very interesting publications. Louis Falk, he is an associate professor of public administration and policy in the School of Public Affairs at American University. We have Mirae Kim. She is an associate professor of nonprofit studies at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. And we have Elizabeth Boris, who is an institute fellow at the Urban Institute, where she was the founding director of the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy and led it for 20 years. We will have presentations from each of our distinguished panelists, and then we will leave some time for question and answers. So as we jump in, please formulate your questions and place them in the chat, and we will get to them in due course. We will go in the following order. Mirae will present the nature of the panel study and plans for subsequent cycles, and mention a little bit about the potential uses of the panel for experimental studies. Louis will then present the main findings in the first year survey. Finally, Elizabeth will conclude by speaking about the value of the research for practitioners and policymakers. Elizabeth, Louis, and Mirae, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it. Mirae, the Zoom room is yours.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Amir, for wonderful introductions. So I really appreciate this opportunity to share about our collaborative research project across 4 institutions that we have been developing for many years. And this year is the first year that we have seen the first project out of our years of collaboration. So I'm gonna give a brief background about the entire panel research project that myself, Louis Fo at American University, and Urban Institute team led by Elizabeth Boris and our partner Georgia Tech University has done together. So then my colleague Louis will introduce the findings from our very first year panel survey. So let me give you a little bit background about the broader project that contains the first year survey that is funded by the National Science Foundation and Journalistic Commission. So the project started with a recognition of the need that most of you attending this seminar series might be aware of, that there's not enough reliable and nationally representative data for robust nonprofit research. We have regional panel surveys or 990 data, but that have their own limitations. So the main goal of this collaborative project was to supplement the current 990 data with the annual surveys that would provide far more detailed information about the sector. Although the first project came out this year, the whole conversation began back in 2015. The key collaborators at Urban Institute, American University, and George Mason University, we began having conversation with other scholars and institutions around the country about the piecemeal nature of the most nonprofit research. That can be aggregated in a way, but that had been limited to provide the understanding of different contribution to the field. So we wanted to find a way to bring the piecemeal nature of the work into more holistic way. This only conversation engaged more than 17 nonprofit researchers around the country and actually around the world. and that have continued since then. And also back in 2015, nonprofit organization research panel, NERD panel project began, and it has been an online panel of nonprofit organizations across the country. And this relatively small panel project has shown the potential of using online panel for nonprofit research, and it served as a prototype for our current relatively bigger collaborative project across the institutions. So the conversation between partner institutions has continued, and in 2020, we had some fruitful outcomes that we received the funding from the Journalistic Commission, a project of the Giving Institute and Giving USA Foundation. And we also received the funding from the National Science Foundation Human Network and Data Science Program to develop the panel for years to come, and also to launch the very first year of the survey and to begin developing the data sharing platform. So the findings of the study that we are going to introduce today is part of this bigger project. So this was just my relatively long way of saying the current project doesn't come out of just 1 year preparation, but it's been a project that we have been working on for many years with a lot of nonprofit scholars around the world. So the end goal is to create a platform that will be called the NERD Manager to recruit and grow representative sample of nonprofit organizations nationally and across communities, states, and regions over time. So this longitudinal data that will be nationally representative will allow public access among the research and practice communities to use existing data, but also build additional project-specific samples using the platform, and also add original surveys to it. So it will be a collaborative nature, not just among the partner institution, but within the entire nonprofit research community. And then the NERD Manager will support the merger of different data sets within the platform, and also it will help us to merge 990 data with many other available data on 501c3 nonprofit organization. Lastly, the NERD Manager will serve as a collaborative repository to manage a bank of core and supplementary questionnaire. Many of you might agree that in the nonprofit research, we are using different survey questions that have been a barrier for researchers to compare the findings. So this would be another way of using the platform. So that brings us to this year one survey. Our team began discussion of the year one survey design in March 2020, when the world started shifting dramatically with the pandemic. So when our team had our kickoff meeting for the year one survey, obviously the focus was slightly different, but that was very helpful because over the years that we found the strong need to have a better understanding of how the sector was impacted. So although that Luis will say a little bit more about it, as you can imagine that we had to include some question about the impact of COVID along the way as we progressed the survey design of this first year survey. So at the same time, when we were designing the instrument, we started working to develop an online platform with the support of NSF funding. And this platform will eventually help us address many technical shortcomings to collect large data, and also to share the panel data set with the general public. Where I'm gonna leave the key findings from year one survey itself for Luis to cover in the next presentation. Here are some outcomes of the year one survey. The year one survey gave us the nationally representative and very rich data set on donation trends, organizational demographics, and the impact of the COVID pandemic. And we provided this rich data set for the public. So anyone who access the link available here can get the data, and the data doesn't include some of the identifiable information, but most of the information that you might be interested in for your own research are available. It's just de-identified to protect the identity of individual organization. But that is one of the contribution of this project, that we provide this rich data set for the research community. The year one survey was administered through Qualtrics, mostly in early 2021. And it documents the extent and scope of donation trends among this nationally representative sample of nonprofit organization. And the target sample was operating 501c3 public charities with 50,000 or more in annual expenses. In this specific sample, we intentionally excluded many specialized service providers like hospitals, schools, higher education institutions, churches, and other houses of worship. We did exclude these organizations, although we do recognize that they are important part of the charitable sector, but our study focused on nonprofit that are the end recipients of donations and that engage in activities that range from direct service provision to community building and advocacy. So that was the reason why that we had to exclude these organizations. And these organizations are often underrepresented in studies of national financial trends because their financial footprint is much smaller than that of hospitals or universities or churches or other organizations that provide more infrastructure level of philanthropic support for the entire sector. And the organization represented in our study tend to depend more on public support than other organizations. So that was how we targeted, we designed the sample of this year one survey panel. Before I turn to Luis to share about, so what were the real findings from the first survey that you keep talking about? So that's what my colleague Luis will cover in the next slides, but here's a snapshot of our next steps. We are currently working to design the second year survey instrument, and many of the questions in the year one survey will be repeated to collect longitudinal data, but some questions will be replaced or new questions will be added. And we are going to continue to refine and test the platform tools. And in order to refine and test the tools functions in the platform, we continue to talk with the potential users of this platform. In other words, the nonprofit researchers and practitioners interested in using the data set. And we strive to expand the research panels that can be part of the broader platform project. So this annual survey panel is definitely one of the important elements, but we plan to expand the panels for different purposes. For instance, there would be a panel of nascent nonprofit, the organization that are relatively new, or another plan for now is a panel of nonprofits that will be dedicated to tell us about nonprofit advocacy activities over the years. So these are different panels that we try to develop and put within this broader platform project. And we also consider some possible uses of the platform for designing field experiment or quasi-experiment research. So there are aspects of the project that may make it possible that we can use the longitudinal nature of the data collection to allow for a treatment or intervention with a random selection or using a natural experiment. So these are some of the plans and ideas that we are currently working on, and we would love to hear some thoughts from the potential user community. So that said, I will leave to Luis to share about the findings from our year one survey.
Great, thank you, Mirae. And Christopher, I saw that you have a question in the Q&A, which I'll try to address in my comments as well. If there are other questions that members of the audience have, please do put those in the Q&A, and then we'll try to keep up with those as best we can. All right, thank you, everybody. Thanks, Amir, and thanks, Mirae, for that introduction to this study. As Mirae mentioned, I'm going to be trying to provide a general brief overview, I'll focus on brief here, of our key findings from the first year survey. That said, as Mirae mentioned, there are a wealth of data in this data set, and we encourage you to access the public use file, which I provided a link to in the chat. Hopefully it went to everybody, and if not, you can use this QR code and QR codes throughout this presentation. If you scan those with your phone, then it should take you to those relevant links. So as Mirae mentioned, the key outcomes of this study extend beyond just the findings from this first year survey, particularly because we are providing these data public use, but also more importantly, we're providing an avenue for greater information on a nationally representative sample of nonprofits, which to date we have a lot of information from unrepresentative or convenient samples. And so this is an important initiative to provide not only first year data, but also long-term panel data on a representative sample of organizations. As Mirae mentioned, the sample was selected to focus on operating organizations instead of pass-through organizations or organizations in higher ed and hospital situations and other kinds of select industries. We provide a lot of detail on the full methodology there in our main report, but if you have any questions on that as well, we can answer those. In general, we have this representative sample of, as I said, operating organizations that are greater than $50,000 in annual revenues and annual expenses. So they're fairly established, but it includes a large set of organizations that are on the smaller end of the general spectrum. In terms of response rates and response characteristics, so this is getting at Christopher's question. We had, similar to many surveys in the last year, we had a lower response rate than we typically see with organizational research. We had around a 10% response rate overall. Our main concern, however, was whether there was any bias in that response rate. And as you can see here, we did weight the final sample to be fully representative of the population of organizations across the US. However, we were surprised and pleasantly surprised to see that there weren't a lot of characteristics that were really biased by the response rates themselves. So in our non-response bias analysis, by these key features that we were looking at, including geographic features, we did not see any indication of bias in the response. We also were really focused heavily on, in this first year especially, on understanding differences across geographical areas, so communities across the United States. One key interest here was looking at low-income zip codes, so organizations operating in and serving the lowest income in society versus other income categories of communities. Again, we didn't find bias in response rates across these communities, but we did intentionally oversample as well in these low-income communities to make sure we had representativeness. Also, we were interested in other kind of geographic divides, so one being urban versus rural versus suburban. And so then again, we have strong representation of organizations in these different types of communities across the United States. The questions that we asked were varied, and we have many questions that we included in this first year of the survey, many of which will be continue to be asked over time in a panel data set. These extend beyond just finances, but also into, in the first year, mission and program characteristics, where organizations are actually providing services rather than just their address on the 990 form. And then many questions in the first year were also focused heavily on what was the impact of the pandemic so far and just the 2020 events in general. I only have I'll skip these two slides. I only have a little bit of time to cover some of our key findings, but we do encourage you to access the full report. We are also producing a series of fact sheets that are coming out of this first year survey. And again, we encourage you to use and dive into the public use data. So these are the key findings that, because this is recorded, people will be able to look back at this slide, but I want to dive into some of these more specifically with some of the numbers here. So our first key finding is that donations from individuals are essential. So a large set of organizations across the different sizes report individual donations being either essential or very important. Key here is that small organizations, so organizations that we're defining as small or less than $500,000 in annual revenue and expenses, those nonprofits, they make up over or around 2/3 of the sector, but they report stronger or higher dependence on individual donations. And as you can see in the graph, those organizations that are smaller are defining those individual donations as essential or very important at greater rates. So individual donations are essential and important, right? Other key findings, we looked at intentionally trends in donations for organizations from the 5-year period leading up to 2020 and then during 2020 itself. We generally found that after the recessionary period that we continued to see increasing donations overall for organizations in the years leading up to the pandemic. Importantly, this matches findings from our overall understanding of donations from Giving USA and other sources. And importantly here, we did generally find this across the board that organizations were experiencing overall growth in donations in the years at least leading up to 2020. 2020 was a great shock, however, as we understand from many angles, but this is also very important to see that greater proportions of organizations reported declining donations in that 2020 period. So one question we have for our next years of the study are how organizations recover from the 2020 period and as we move through the pandemic and beyond. There were some disparities that we want to highlight. So smaller organizations, again, that are under $500,000 in annual budgets experience greater declines in the 2020 period than larger organizations. And this was a trend that we generally saw in these 2020 impacts for small organizations that were disproportionately impacted by the 2020 events. We also identified some longer term concerning trends, some underlying trends that were taking place before the pandemic. And one is that organizations that were led by people of color, so organizations with executive directors of color, experienced greater declines in donations or greater proportions of those organizations experienced declines in donations in the 5 years leading up to the pandemic. And fewer of those organizations reported increases in donations during that time period. So there are already underlying disparities that we've identified that, again, we want to continue to track and understand better as we unfold future surveys. There were also important urban-rural divides. One interesting finding was that urban organizations or organizations operating out of the urban core environment tended to see greater growth in donations, or greater proportions of those organizations experienced growth in the 5 years leading up to the pandemic than rural organizations. However, urban core organizations also experienced relative declines in that trend, or changes in that trend to a greater degree. So we have some thoughts on this in our overall findings and discussion in our report, but this is an interesting divide that we're also, it's not as concerning necessarily as just interesting from a research perspective to understand the variation in donations across these geographic spaces. And then we have a set of findings that I just want to briefly review and then turn it over to Elizabeth Boris. But we did find other important impacts of 2020 beyond donations. So fees for service declined Again, small or relatively small organizations tended to be hit hardest with fees for service decline. Arts organizations, which is understandable since they rely heavily on ticket sales and other types of fees for service, were extremely hard hit. And especially with stay-at-home orders and other types of pandemic-related impacts, those organizations were hard hit beyond their donations. And then in terms of human resources and volunteers, we saw not as much sharp decline in paid staff, except for part-time paid staff, especially in rural and suburban environments, but extremely heavy hits to volunteers. And this is, again, understandable from a pandemic-related perspective. However, it's important to recognize that the organizations that depend most heavily on donations are also depending most heavily on volunteers. So this double hit or triple hit, really, of donations and volunteers and fees for service created important impacts in 2020 that we're interested in follow-up surveys to understand how organizations are recovering. I'll just briefly show these two screens. So some of the responses of organizations to these pandemic-related effects and other effects of 2020. You can explore these more in our report, but just to highlight some of the depth of the data that we have, including the ways that organizations responded in terms of people served and how they responded in their services. With that, I'd like to thank the Generosity Commission, National Science Foundation, and other funders, including independent sector, who provided in-kind support to our first year survey. And we're excited about the future surveys that are coming out. Thank you again. I'll leave these QR codes up for more information if anybody would like to click on that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Louis, and thank you, Mirae, and thank you, Amir, for having us. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the value of this research for practitioners and for policymakers. As my colleagues have said, this panel data set will be a source of reliable trend data on US charitable nonprofit organizations, full stop. It will revolutionize the study of nonprofits by updating the information on a regular basis and providing an accessible data platform for research, much as the Philanthropy panel study at the Lilly School has done for giving and volunteering information. For practitioners and policymakers, these data provide a solid, nationally representative source of information on nonprofits. This information will not shift because of sampling differences. The methods are transparent so that users know what types of organizations are represented and the way the study was conducted. Nonprofit practitioners can use the data for example, planning purposes, for peer comparisons, for advocacy with funders and policymakers. They can also identify geographic areas that may be under or overserved or under or overfinanced. This data is so rich in the ways that you can look at the data by size, by type, by geographic region. Policymakers can use the data to assess the impact of various economic, tax, and regulatory policies, not only on 501c3s, but also in certain geographies or by income and demographic variables. And as Mirae noted, we'll be able to do some experiments to see, for example, the impact of various regulations or policies. Researchers will have the ability to go deeply in particular issues in future iterations of the study. These could include advocacy activities, fundraising investments, the impacts of tax reform or regulations, and the longer-term impacts of COVID on nonprofit operations. They could include studies of organizations not in the original sample. For example, hospitals and higher ed, we could develop modules for those organizations. And as was also mentioned, survey questions will be tested, refined, and standardized. That will lead to better comparisons across studies, raising the quality and reliability of findings. And also, this is a collaborative project, as Mirae showed. So the whole research enterprise on nonprofit organizations will benefit from these data. We'll be able to merge different kinds of data together The platform will be accessible and open with proper safeguards for confidentiality, but it will be a tool that as we said, we've planned for many years and finally are realizing. So this is all by way of saying very quickly that the panel data set and the NORP manager will be a real game changer for those of us who are interested in what's happening to nonprofit organizations. And to put it on the table, many of us are interested in the sustainability of organizations and how well they're doing and how the various financial trends affect them, especially giving and volunteering in these difficult years. So with that, I'll turn it back to Amir, who can lead us into questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Louis, and thank you, Mirae, for giving us this wonderfully succinct description of what is a large, complex, and, as Elizabeth says, revolutionary contribution to our field and knowledge of our civic sector. So let me encourage our audience to put your questions into the Q&A box. But to get us started, I will start off with a few questions. So my first question is to get a sense of the segment that you have pulled out, which is kind of the non-eds and meds and non-religious. So when we think about the size of our nonprofit sector, but either in revenue or in terms of employment, Urban Institute always gives us a sense of where that is going. How much of our overall nonprofit sector, either in revenue and or in kind of employment, are we talking about that you have captured?
Thanks, Amir. I can briefly answer that, and then if Elizabeth and Mirae want to jump in as well. So to give you an idea of the overall scope of the organizations that we sampled from, we drew directly from the 990 file. So if you're familiar with the 990 records, we have somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 organizations in the core files from the NCCS, so organizations with 990 data. When we exclude organizations that are mutual organizations or associations that are more infrastructure organizations in the sector, or organizations that are supporting organizations. So these are organizations that provide funding to other organizations. When we exclude those, our sample frame includes around 117,000 organizations. So somewhere between a third and a fourth of the 990 universe, right? 990 filing universe that we're focused on here. But again, we were very intentional in the sample restrictions that we applied to be representative of these organizations operating in communities, providing services, and really organizations, as Mirae mentioned, that are the end users of donations in the sector, right? But that's a great point, because we can, one of the utilities here of this project are developing a methodology that can be applied to other samples that we could draw using similar methods, but to be able to provide other panels. As Mirae mentioned, we have a panel project that we're developing with some other collaborators on startup organizations. So those newest organizations won't be represented in the data that we're presenting. So we're providing supplement panels to be able to follow as well. So these are Mirae or Elizabeth, would you like to add to that, or does that answer your question, Amir?
Yes, thank you. Elizabeth or Mirae, would you like to add to that?
No, rather than adding that, I just wanted to note something, that there have been questions in the Q&A box saying that the chat is disabled for the attendees, because we wanted to share the link to the study where the attendees can also access the data set.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how to share everything with the audience, but we will definitely share the slides and all the links in a follow-up email to every attendee and even everybody who did not attend. So they will get the links.
We also have the QR code that Louis shared with the screen. So that could also work.
Great. And some say that they can see the links in the chat, they just can't post. So whether you've already received it or not, you'll get another chance to get it in the follow-up for sure. So not to worry about that.
And I tried to respond to one question in the Q&A with a link, but also if everybody's okay with it, I'll share my screen again with that last slide, just to show those QR codes if everybody wants to use those.
Sure, go ahead, Louis, that'd be helpful. As you're doing that, Louis, I was just going to follow up with the startup. So is this a sense of trying to understand the many new nonprofits that are formed every year, or is there a special category of startup that you have in mind?
So we have a separate panel in development for relatively new or just startup nonprofit organizations. So they are not necessarily part of this year one survey, although there are young organizations in the survey in our sampling frame. But we are intentionally building another panel group of organizations that are founded since 2018. And so they are nascent organization, relatively new organization that they will be a separate panel within the platform that we want to follow their development over the years, how these young startup nonprofit grow over the years. But they are not necessarily part of this panel. So one thing that I want to emphasize is this platform is an evolving project. So although that we have this panel that was established this year, and we will continue to follow over the years with a different set of questions, they are not the only panel that will be part of the platform. And in the coming Arnova conference, we will have a session to talk about this panel project. And one thing that we will let the attendees to know about is we welcome potential collaborators who might be interested in building their own panel, but then collaborate with us to have the panel to be part of the platform, so that the panel developed by a team of researchers can be actually shared for the general nonprofit research community, of course, with the proper governance protocol provided by the platform development team. And also one related thing I wanted to mention is there was a question about if we are soliciting survey questions for the following years. We are not currently sending out seeking for questions, but we've been like the opportunity like this one, that we've been seeking opportunity to share about this project. And part of the goal is to solicit the research question or the survey question that must be answered through annual surveys. What are the data gap in the field that we can help to fill with these annual panel surveys? So we always welcome getting ideas from the field so we can incorporate the need of those data into development of our year two survey. And same as year one survey data, the year two survey data will be publicly released once the survey closes.
Great,
thank you so much. Go ahead, Elizabeth, go ahead.
I also saw a question about how we got the actual survey questions into the study itself. And there was a process of an independent sector convening some groups. And also we looked at a lot of work that was done by Kirsten Gromberg and others. So we searched widely for what was relevant and necessary, and also surveyed questions that had been used before and that fit what we were trying to do with the survey. I don't know, Louis or Mirae, if you want to add to that.
Louis has been diligently responding to questions in the Q&A box, so I thought maybe.
So I'm trying to keep up with some of that, but no, I just am nodding my head to agree.
I thought maybe Louis, you could speak in general in case not everybody in the audience is following the Q&A box. Just if you might respond to
sure,
the Mark Tony Wilhelm's question and the other ones that you have just maybe synthesized what you responded there.
Of course, yeah. So Rich asked about other researchers being engaged in developing questionnaires, and that is something that's designed into this overall project, and it has been from its beginnings. So as Mirae mentioned in her talk, we've engaged around 80 scholars from across the US and really international scholars as well in the visioning of this project. And that's something we're excited about in the next year of the NSF project, to engage more of those scholars in developing other panels that would use the platform tools and provide data through the platform. This is related to Mark's question on can these different panels be combined? That's also one of the core design features of our sampling methodology, to be able to sample primarily based on the 990 data, so we can weight those different panels to be representative and to be combined for a larger set of nationally representative organizations. However, with the startup panel, it's a little distinct because we're sampling on a different IRS form. It's more on the form that organizations use to apply for tax exempt status. And so eventually those organizations will enter, or many of those organizations will enter the 990 record. Those organizations aren't yet visible on the 990 record for the most part. But one feature, again, that we're really excited about is the panel nature of the project. So to be able to follow this startup panel, for instance, over time, and then be able to see as those organizations enter the 990 database, to be able to track those organizations. But more importantly here, one important aspect of, or one shortcoming of a lot of the research we have, for instance, on how organizations develop over time, is that we have a survivor bias, right? So organizations that end up in the 990 record are the organizations that grew enough to be able to do that. Those organizations that stay in the 990 record are the ones that are the strongest. And so that's something that we're also trying to approach in this research project, to be able to understand growth and trajectories of organizations without having those biases that come up in the administrative records. So a long-winded answer there. Sorry if I over-answered there, but some of the things we're excited about. So thank you for these questions.
That's terrific, because we had several questions from our academic cohorts, and they're very keen to understand how you put this together. But one of the purposes of the SPY series is to engage academics with practitioners. And so let me ask you a practitioner question in terms of some of the trends you've seen in terms of income from donations coming to your panel. And do you have any information in terms of kind of how that might correspond to investments they would have made into fundraising or into fundraising staff? Is there any connection there that you can draw now or will look to in the future?
I can again answer briefly here. So this is another, I want to point people towards the public use data set, because we do have really good data on a lot of aspects that we haven't reported on yet. And one is how organizations responded during the pandemic to those difficulties. And some of those questions relate to fundraising experiences. This is a really great question, though, to understand more fully. So one other aspect here with this panel is that we can combine the survey data directly with the 990 data. So to be able to get at different data on questions like fundraising expenses or other types of organization capacities that pre-exist that could inform some of our analysis of future waves. Elizabeth or Mirae, do you have other responses there?
No, thank you for answering that question. But I know that we want to answer more on practitioner focused question. But also the part of the region that we had the data released for the public use is for practitioners to download and look at the data of their peer organization, the organization in the same region or the same type. So I hope that might be very useful tool or useful the benefits of the data. But there's also one question, since it's related to what Boris just mentioned, that our survey data can be merged with the 990 data set. That's one way of looking different questions, as we didn't specifically ask about how much they invested in fundraising for this year's survey, but that's our the questions that can be answered when we have longitudinal data with the year 2, year 3 survey. But indeed, that as one of the questions that 990 data can be inaccurate at times, and the question is, do your survey attempts to allow respondents to correct the base 990 data or cross-check in some ways? We actually intentionally did that. So for instance, the information about the location of the organization, where the address of where that they fired the 990 can be inaccurate. So we did ask about where they actually operate, and we did cross-check those information. And we also asked about their finance, but those finance information, just because of the delay in 990 data release, so it will take some time for us to start cross-checking the information, but we did ask the finance question with the intention to cross-check the numbers in 2 years when 990 data become available for our use.
Thank you.
If I can just add there too, Amir. So one thing we do extend beyond the 990 is being able to break out the public support or the public support revenue. We can break it out not only with government grants and private donations, but we also break out foundation grants from individual donations. And so important ways we're adding to the 990 data, in addition to, as Mirae mentioned, trying to check the 990 data in some ways. And I also responded in the Q&A to some other ways that we've been looking at those data.
So I think it's wonderful that you've created the kind of the public data so that people can go in and download it. And so I'm sometimes when practitioners are given that freedom, they're worried that it might not be user friendly. So I'm just wondering, are there tutorials, or is it just so self-evident? Could even I go there and try to make sense of this, or is there some kind of special training in order to be able to make sense of this data?
Great question, Amir. And this is part of our National Science Foundation funding and collaboration with the computer science team led by Professor Colton Poo at Georgia Tech, where we're developing a user-friendly platform for the data analysis as well. So the team at Georgia Tech is heavily engaged right now in using the public use data files and using our scripts from our analysis to develop user-friendly, think of point and click types of analysis that you can do in an interactive website that we hope to go live with soon. Mirae and Elizabeth, other thoughts on that? You can dive into the public use data set, and we've tried to make it as user-friendly as possible. So with the descriptions of the variables and coding, but we understand the challenges there as well.
Right. Unfortunately, we started the development of the platform when we started working on the year 1 survey. I mean, we were fortunate to have 2 grants came in at the same time in 2020. And I know that 2020 has been not a great year for most of people around the world with the pandemic, but for this project, that was the year that our effort has come to some fruitful outcome to get started the project. But because the year 1 survey and the platform project started at the same time, it will take 1 or 2 more years for us to implement to incorporate the year 1 survey into the platform and have it available for those who do not have a fancy statistical knowledge, but still we did acknowledge that barrier. So the coding book that you will find in the link that Luis provided on the slide, that you will find the spreadsheet with the detailed information about the data set. It comes with the data dictionary, and we try to provide as much information as possible, but I also acknowledge that it can be somewhat daunting for those who doesn't work with those spreadsheet day to day.
So if people go there and find it too daunting, there's more ease of use coming. Elizabeth, go ahead.
I would just add that, like you, Amir, easier the better. so that those of us who aren't as sophisticated can use the data. So I think that is one of the overarching goals, to make this not only for the sophisticated research user, but for the more general user, policymakers and practitioners as well. It's one of our goals.
Yeah, that's terrific, because we know, in the business world, there's all kinds of government and other sources of information that people can draw on, and this is adding to our small but growing reservoir of important data about our sector going forward. Well, let me then, since we're approaching the end of my time, allow each of you to kind of leave with our audience what you think the key, the most important takeaway is. And before I get there, let me just also ask you to comment on something that you brought up, and is kind of the correspondence of this panel to some of the work that we do at the Lilly Family School. And as you know, we have this concern that actually animated the Generosity Commission, that the number of U.S. households who are giving is going down. And I'm just wondering, what that means for the 73% of your panel who find individual donations so important. Are you concerned about that going forward? And then also, please leave us with what you think is the most important takeaway for our audience today. And let's continue in the same order that we started off with. So let's start with Mirae.
Thank you for that important question. Indeed, that was what sparked the project that we have seen. The giving by the so-called small donors have been decreasing over the years, and so that was one of the motivation to start this project. And when we started analyzing the result once the survey closed, we were at first a little bit startled, because organizations were actually saying that they had seen some increases rather than decreases. So I must confess that at first, among us, like Louis and myself and Elizabeth and other researchers on the team, that we had a meeting and we tried to poke each other, like, did we miss something, or did we do some wrong analysis? And we checked over and over. That was the finding. The organization was seeing like overall increasing trend, but that was before the pandemic. And in 2020, the narrative started to change. So we tried to reconcile what was happening, but then what we found was that was because we tried to look at the general trend, like as if the entire operating nonprofits are just one entity, one type of nonprofit. So when we started to disaggregate the type of organization in rural area versus suburban area, or organization led by people of color, or organizations serving mostly low-income communities, we started seeing differences. So, and then the differences that we saw made us concerned that the decreased level of giving made by small donors who make smaller donations, that has made impact for those who tend to serve marginalized population or organization led by people of color. So that does concern me, and 2020 has hit all organizations across the types. So even the larger organizations or organizations in suburban area, organizations led by white, they all got hit hard. So it remains to be seen how they recover, and when they recover, whether we will see the different recovery patterns across different types of organizations.
Great, thank you. Let's turn to Louis.
I'll just add there really that we're really interested in seeing these longer term trends and how organizations across these different categories, how they recover from the 2020 period, right? Because it's one thing to look at that pre-existing trend, which, as Mirae mentioned, was overall generally positive, right? But placed in context that was coming out of the economic recession. And some organizations reported in their open-ended responses that things were getting better right before the pandemic hit. So an open question on the economic cycle and what we're going into in the next coming years, but more importantly, if there are going to be disparities in that recovery period. And And then I'm going to yield the rest of my time to Elizabeth.
Well, I'm particularly fascinated by the diversity of organizations. As Mirae said, when you start disaggregating, you realize the fallacy of talking about in one breath the whole sector. And I think that's just reinforced by our findings. I'm particularly interested in rural, urban, suburban, and the way that organizations are spread around the country. We often hear that, the service providing organizations are mostly in core cities, but we really can say that organizations are in all parts of the country. And now we have the data to really dig in more deeply. What kinds are they and who are they serving? Because we actually have information on where they're serving. Donations being essential. I think that is a really important thing to emphasize, and how they're using those donations is important. And the other thing that fascinates me is that 66% of the organizations applied for a PPP loan. And how did that play into the financial security of organizations? Who got them? Who didn't? Did it make a huge difference? So I think we have really interesting data to really dig into. And I encourage all the researchers out there to take advantage, because they're wonderful questions we can be answering.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Indeed, I think this is such a rich tool, rich insight into the great diversity that is our civic life. I won't use the word sector. That implies a certain uniformity that we should stay away from. So allow me to thank you, Elizabeth, Lewis, and Mirae, for giving us an insight into a report that I think many of us on the line are going to be using and talking about, and continuing to be an important source of information and insight into our civic lives. And I want to thank all our participants on Zoom for joining us. If you have any comments on the substance or format of our conversation, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And if I can't answer anything, I will contact our panelists or whoever else can help you. In conclusion, I also want to invite all of you to return on December 2nd for our session on social image and giving with Luigi Butera from the Copenhagen Business School and Christine Exley from Harvard Business School. Thank you all for your time, and stay safe. I'll see you next time. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.